Hello everyone, today we're covering chapter 8 and we'll be learning about hallucinogens. By definition, a hallucinogen is a drug that acts on the central nervous system and produces hallucinatory effects. And so some of those effects can be seeing images that are not there in reality, hearing sounds, and feeling sensations that seem real but do not exist. Here's a YouTube video that causes you to have a hallucinatory effect. I mean, it's just a little quick video if you want to see what it feels like to hallucinate. It's not dangerous, don't worry. There are different types of hallucinations. Some are auditory, meaning that you're hearing things that others can't hear. There's gustatory, which is false perceptions of taste. So you think you're eating something or tasting something. There's olfactory hallucinations, which is a false perception of smell. Visual hallucinations, which are false visuals. These are things that nobody else can perceive. And tactile, which is a false sensation of touch. Let's talk a little bit about the history of hallucinogens. And so people have been using hallucinogens for centuries, and it's also part of cultural and religious ceremonies. As part of their religion, for example, certain American Indian tribes use hallucinogens like peyote to experience spiritual visions. Hallucinogens here in the United States started to surge in the 60s and 70s, in the hippie era. And so there was a huge rise in use, and then it started to slow down in the 80s, but now it's starting to pick up again. And so in recent years, there's been a number of synthetic hallucinogens that have been produced. Synthetic meaning that they are produced in a lab. And so now there's a wider range of the different types of hallucinogens that people can take. And one of them is a popular one called LSD, which is made in the lab. So there are 4 classes of hallucinogens, and this is how they work pharmacologically. And so I do want you to understand how each one works on the receptors and on the central nervous system. And so there are serotonergic hallucinogens. So try to guess which neurotransmitter is being affected just by the name of serotonergic. So that's serotonin. If you said serotonin, you are correct. And so serotonergic hallucinogens are synthetic compounds like LSD. And they're not just synthetic, even the non-synthetic ones have this effect too. But examples are LSD, mescaline, which is from peyote, and psilocybin, which is obtained from mushrooms. And Oregon, I think, is one of the first states, and maybe the only state, that has actually legalized psilocybin for treatments like PTSD and alcoholism and whatnot. And so these type of serotonergic hallucinogens, what they do is they mimic serotonin. And so they're basically acting like serotonin. And so if they act like serotonin, that means that they can bind onto serotonin receptors. And if they can bind to serotonin receptors, that means that they can have an effect on the neurons. And so they just mimic serotonin. And we know that serotonin, we've learned about this before, affects our mood. And so that's where the sensations and the different moods that people feel, come from. It's from this effect of increasing the amount of serotonin effect. And so it causes a greater release of serotonin by attaching to serotonin receptors and produces vivid visual hallucinations and a variety of other effects on consciousness. Then there's methylated amphetamines. And so these drugs are kind of like an amphetamine, but it's with a methyl group. I mean, don't worry about what that means. It's just a chemical term. But it acts similar to an amphetamine. And that includes MDA and MDMA, which is more known as ecstasy or Molly. And so it's structurally related to amphetamine and acts like a reuptake inhibitor. And so if you remember, the reuptake inhibitors prevent the neurotransmitter from being recycled. And so that means there's more neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft. So this causes an increase in norepinephrine, serotonin, and a little bit on dopamine. And it produces alterations in mood and consciousness with little or no sensory change. Anticholinergic hallucinogens are basically drugs like scopolamine, atropine, which are found in plants like mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and jimsonweed. And these block muscarinic receptors from the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So if you're blocking an acetylcholine receptor, that means that acetylcholine cannot stimulate neurons. So it's preventing acetylcholine stimulation. And if you remember, acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. And so if you're preventing a neurotransmitter from exciting the neurons, that means that it's causing a sedative effect, like a relaxed effect. And having way too much acetylcholine blocking can even lead to paralysis. And so these type of drugs produce a dreamlike trance where the user awakens with little or no memory of the experience. And it's believed that acetylcholine has a role in memory, so that's probably why a person can't remember what's going on. And then there's dissociative anesthetics, which means that a person feels like they're out of body. It's kind of like an out of body experience. And this includes PCP, which is also known as angel dust, and the related compounds like ketamine. And so one of the main effects, this is just the main pathway, that it does other things too. Most of these drugs will increase dopamine, will increase serotonin. So the hallucinogens are the ones that are more likely to increase serotonin. And pretty much all drugs increase dopamine. But one of the effects of this is that it blocks NMDA receptors. It's an NMDA receptor antagonist, which means that it blocks NMDA. And this is basically what it causes is like a sedative effect. Again, it makes a person feel relaxed. But specifically, this makes a person feel like they're out of body, like they're kind of conscious, but they don't feel like they're in their own body. It's like an out-of-body experience. All right, so there are several categories in how these drugs are derived. They can be found in nature, in animals and plants. So mescaline, psilocybin, which is found in mushrooms, Jimson weed, ayahuasca. This is where people get DMT from. And bufotenine, which is actually from a toad, and so this is like toad licking, and a toad is a frog. So these right here are, from animals or plants. And then there's synthetic laboratory made drugs, and so synthesizing LSD, PCP, DMT, and MDMA. Remember we said this is ecstasy. All of these are made in the laboratory. And so let's talk about each one individually. We'll start with animals and plants. And so I do want you to know the type of drug that they are. So mescaline, I want you to know that it's serotonergic. And psilocybin is also serotonergic. And if you hear the word serotonergic, that means that it acts like serotonin. So it increases the effect of serotonin. It increases serotonin and it acts like serotonin. So this is just amplifying the activity of serotonin neurons. It's meaning that there's more serotonin around, and we know that serotonin affects mood. And then there's Jimson weed, which is anticholinergic, which means that it blocks, so against, so it's blocking cholinergic receptors. And so that means that acetylcholine can't bind, which causes a sedative, relaxed effect. And then there's ayahuasca and bufotenine, which are also serotonergic, meaning that they increase serotonin. And they also end up increasing norepinephrine and dopamine. And so these drugs are found in nature. Mescaline, so it's a hallucinogen obtained from a small spineless cactus peyote. And the earliest recorded time peyote has been used is by natives in the northwestern Mexico and southwestern United States as part of traditional religious rites. The drug is usually taken orally without chewing, although it can still be smoked or even injected. Its chemical structure is close to that of amphetamine, like a stimulant. Its street names are buttons, peyote, and mesk. The psychological effects basically is a very long-lasting, what they call a trip, which lasts for about 12 hours. And so the person will feel the effect of a drug for about 12 hours, if not longer. Vomiting usually occurs after ingestion. And so a user then sees sensory images and flashes of color, followed by geometric patterns and sometimes images of people and animals. Time and space perception are distorted, and people get the feeling of being outside their body. The physical effects are dilated pupils, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, anxiety, the feeling of dying, um, fear of not being able to return to normal consciousness. Lethal doses produce convulsions, breath arrest, and heart failures, and death is due to respiratory failure. And so having too much can be, very toxic. Psilocybin, which is found in mushrooms, is basically a hallucinogenic compound obtained from certain mushrooms. The use of these mushrooms is ancient, dates back from AD 100 to 1400, appearing throughout Mexico and Central America. It's probably the second most frequently used hallucinogen in the United States. Some of the street names are magic mushrooms, shrooms, or people say when they're shrooming. That means that they're using these type of mushrooms with psilocybin. Psilocybin mushrooms, the administration is eaten raw, cooked in food, brewed in tea, dried and ingested. And so, how long does it last once taken? It can be anywhere from 5 to 6 hours. You can watch this YouTube video here if you want to learn more about it. And I have another one too, so feel free to look at any of these YouTube videos if you want to learn more about it. The physical effects are nausea, dilated pupils, and tightness in the neck. The psychological effects are induced sensory hallucinations, and so these are seeing things that are not there, feeling things that are not there, and whatnot. So hearing things that are not real. Is it addictive? It is not considered an addictive drug like cocaine, heroin, or alcohol because it does not produce the same compulsive drug-seeking behavior, meaning that it's not hitting the dopamine pleasure centers as much. Remember, these are more serotonergic. But like addictive drugs, it produces greater tolerance in some users who take the drug repeatedly, and so that means that a person needs to take more and more over time just to have the same effect. Psilocybin has a therapeutic use as well. Well, there's research that is undergoing in which they suggest that psilocybin can be therapeutic, and it's been legalized, from my understanding, in Oregon. I don't know what other states have legalized it, but I don't think there's other ones. I think it's just Oregon. And so, a large dose of psilocybin has been used in clinical trials at Johns Hopkins University. And so volunteers who go on a 6-hour, sometimes terrifying but often life-changing psychedelic journey end up having positive effects out of it. And so most dramatic results have been seen in terminal cancer patients. Others have reported reduced levels of anxiety and depression, and others use psychedelics to stop smoking and drinking. And the same thing has been said of ayahuasca. I've just seen a lot of YouTube videos on people that have taken ayahuasca, and they feel like it's been really like a life-revealing experience. I'm not saying to go use it. I'm not saying that, that's true. It's just, I did some research and I found it to be pretty interesting. All right, there's also Jimson weed. And so Jimson weed is a common name for a plant known botanically as Datura stramonium, which has been used as a medicine and intoxicant for centuries. Its name comes from the colonial Jamestown. And so this is when colonizers started coming to the United States. And so this is where settlers became very ill after mistakenly eating it as a salad. It is found in most of the continental United States, from New England down to Texas. Its street names are Jamestown weed, thornapple, stinkweed, and local weed. And the trip can last on average from anywhere to 24 to 48 hours, depending on the dosage. Jimson weed effects, these are physiological, can be amnesia, confusion, delirium, bizarre dream state. And its physical effects are dry mouth, increased heart rate, elevated body temperature, increase in breathing, dilated pupils, and blurred vision. So there's a quick little story about Jimson weed, which is written in the Jamestown Story. And so this is a story written by Robert Beverly. And this happened in the state of Virginia in 1705. And so the soldiers, they took this Jimson weed, and he wrote this. He said that the soldiers presented a very pleasant comedy, for they turned natural fools upon it for several days. One would blow up a feather in the air, Another would dart straws at it in very much fury, and another, stark naked, was sitting up in a corner like a monkey, grinning and making mows at them. A fourth would fondly kiss and paw his companions, and sneer in their faces with a countenance more antic than any in Dutch droll. In this frantic condition they were confined, lest they should in their folly destroy themselves. And so that means that they had to be held back because these guys were just tripping on Jimson weed. And so, though it was observed that all their actions were full of innocence and good nature, indeed they were not very cleanly, for they would have wallowed in their own excrements if they had not been prevented. 1,000 such simple tricks they played, and after 11 days returned themselves again, not remembered anything that had happened. It's crazy. Another type of psychedelic is called bufotenine, which is derived from toads. And so this is like toad licking. People call it toad licking as well. And so it's a poisonous hallucinogen alkaloid obtained from the skin glands of toads. And it's from a specific type of toad. It comes from the genus Bufo, and some from mushrooms. And so it's found on the skin of psychoactive toads, orally taken by licking the toad's skin, or you can extract it just by milking it under the chin, and then it can be created as a substance to be smoked. You know, I've seen an Instagram page here in San Diego, and so I'm not sure if this is legal, but I'm assuming it's legal since it's advertised in San Diego, where there's a professional who actually does this. They abstract this stuff from the toad, and they burn it onto your skin. And it looks like a cigarette burn. It looks like somebody just put a cigarette burn onto your skin. But I see, there's this Instagram page that I've read about, and you can like make an appointment here in San Diego and do it. It's kind of crazy. I'm assuming it's legal if like they're freely, have this on the website, but I haven't looked it up myself. And I'm not saying that I recommend doing it. I'm just saying that I found it interesting that there's a person who actually administers this type of toad poison to people. So the physical effects are increases blood pressure, it constricts blood vessels, so that's why your muscles feel kind of cramped. Blurred vision, temporary paralysis. Bufotenine is a very weak form of LSD. It is hallucinogenic, but not as strong. And some people take it for like medicine, for PTSD or to learn about themselves spiritually and whatnot. At least that's what I read from the website. And this is how the toad looks like. And so these are several of the different types of species. And in some cases, some people have experienced something that's called trip and flashback. And so that's why you have to be very careful when using hallucinogens. And so a trip is a drug-induced temporary psychosis or psychedelic crisis. And a flashback is an unexpected, relived experience from a hallucination, meaning that so a flashback occurs suddenly, often without warning, and may occur within a few days or more than a year after having used a hallucinogen. So you don't have to be currently on a hallucinogen. You can have this type of flashback days, weeks, months, or years later. And so here's a case. So both frequent users and one-time experimenters can find themselves on another trip when they least expect it, while driving a car, swimming, playing sports. One young woman's flashback was so intense that she jumped out of the window in a high-rise apartment building. The flashback came 6 months after her only use ever with LSD. Now that's crazy. All right, let's talk about the synthetic compounds, which are the compounds that are made in the lab, which is LSD, PCP, DMT, and MDMA. Now, DMT is also found in ayahuasca, and ayahuasca is, natural. That's a compound that, is made in nature. It's a plant, and you can just brew it and get the DMT out of it. But it can also be synthesized. And so that's why I didn't talk about ayahuasca, just because DMT is the main psychoactive component. So I'll talk about DMT, in the coming up slides. And so just make sure that, you know the difference, or at least partly their pharmacological effects, in which LSD is serotonergic, meaning that its main way that it works is because it increases the serotonin levels. PCP is that dissociative anesthetic, meaning that it makes a person feel like they're out of body, and it also makes them feel relaxed and like an anesthetic, like what a person takes when they're about to undergo surgery, so it kind of numbs them. DMT is serotonergic as well, so it affects the serotonin levels, the mood. Not to say that they don't affect the dopamine levels or that they don't affect norepinephrine. They do. They affect norepinephrine. You get increased levels, and to some degree, increased dopamine. But they're mostly known because the serotonergic ones mimic serotonin, and so they bind onto the same receptors. And then there's MDMA, which is the methylated amphetamine, meaning that it's kind of like an amphetamine, um, and it works kind of like an amphetamine, which is like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor and a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, and so it just allows more of this neurotransmitter to hang out at the synaptic cleft. So these drugs are synthetically produced in a laboratory. LSD, which stands for lysergic acid diethylamide, is a crystalline compound derived from lysergic acid. It was first discovered in 1938 by Dr. Albert Hofmann, and it is manufactured it first came from a fungus called ergot, which grows on rye. And some people think that, moldy rye bread may make you hallucinate. But yeah, so this compound was first discovered from the lysergic acid, and then it's been synthesized in the lab, meaning that you can just chemically produce it in test tubes. And so, it was found on a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. So Albert Hofmann, a chemist working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, synthesized LSD for the first time in 1938, and this was done in Switzerland. He did this while he was looking for a blood stimulant. However, its hallucinogenic effects were unknown until 1943 when Hoffman accidentally consumed some LSD, which is funny because quite a bit of drugs are found by accidental consumption or by accidentally spilling them and then seeing the effect. This is not uncommon. So it was later found that an oral dose of as little as 25 micrograms, and this is equal in weight to a few grams of salt, is capable of producing vivid hallucinations. Psychiatrists used LSD through 1940s and 50s and 60s and tried to find a medical use for it. Free samples supplied by Sandoz Pharmaceuticals for the experiments were distributed broadly, causing widespread use. I had seen a video actually in the 50s of a lady who was on LSD, and they're just asking her, how do you feel, and what are the effects? So there's some videos out there on YouTube if you want to see them. And so LSD is an odorless, colorless, and has a slightly bitter taste. Usually taken orally, although it can be placed on blotter paper and then divided up for multiple uses. Also sold in gelatin squares and pills. Less than 0.001 gram, which is like a thousandth of a gram, of LSD produces extreme hallucinations, which is a lot. LSD takes effect within 30 minutes, and it can last up to 12 hours or even longer. In April 1943, there was Bicycle Day, and Bicycle Day is an international holiday that commemorates the date that Dr. Albert Hofmann first tripped on LSD and bicycled home from his lab in Basel, Switzerland. Alright, so LSD effects, the psychological effects. Severe, terrifying thoughts and feelings, fear of losing control, fear of insanity and death and despair. And some fatal accidents have occurred during states of LSD intoxication. But in general, it's a hallucinogenic, and so we know that, it causes people to see things, hear things, feel things that are not there. And its physical effects are dilated pupils, higher body temperature, increased heart rate, sweating, loss of appetite, sleeplessness, dry mouth, and tremors. Alright, so let's talk about PCP, which is another synthetic drug formed in the lab. So it's known as phencyclidine, but short for PCP, which is a drug that is used in veterinary medicine as an anesthetic and illegally as a hallucinogen. PCP was developed in the 1950s as an intravenous anesthetic, but due to the side effects of confusion and delirium, its development for human medical use was discontinued. PCP is produced in liquid, powder, and tablet form. The route of administration is smoked in a powdered form, snorted, injected, or swallowed. The effects of PCP are a moderate amount causes users to feel detached, distant, and estranged from their surroundings. So it's that out of body feeling. PCP primarily causes auditory hallucinations, image distortion, severe mood disorders, and amnesia also occur. High doses can cause seizures, coma, and even death. And like LSD, it is highly unpredictable. Some users feel out of touch with their bodies and surroundings, others get so revved up and become violent. And so, to the left, here are the top 10 signs that someone is abusing PCP. They stay in one spot for hours. Their eyes keep rolling back to their head. They fall off balance. They're sensitive to sound. And this is actually some side effects than other hallucinogens as well. Their pupils are dilated. They have blurred vision. They have a temporary speech impediment. They have random uncontrollable outbursts. They hear and see things that aren't there, and they constantly stare into space. All right, DMT, which is probably the best known hallucinogenic compound in ayahuasca. This is a bitter brown liquid. Well, this is when it comes from ayahuasca. Created by combining two plants, the ayahuasca vine and shrub called chacruna, and has been used ritually and medicinally by Amazonian tribes for centuries. You know, people take special vacations to do ayahuasca for several days, like with a shaman usually that will guide you. And so, a shaman is like a spiritually inclined person who has experience, I guess, with using ayahuasca. But DMT is also made in the lab as well. It's also, it first was discovered, in a plant, but then made synthetically, with test tubes and chemicals and whatnot. And so it's associated with shamanism and practice among indigenous peoples like Urarina of the Peruvian Amazon. I've seen videos of people who have taken vacations to do ayahuasca, and they'll do it in a course of several days. And they just talk about, like, really the medicinal effects that it had on them. It's pretty interesting to hear about. Excuse me. So, what is DMT? It's a powerful psychedelic and hallucinogenic drug. It's a tryptamine molecule that occurs naturally in many animals and plants, and historically used by many cultures for rituals and healing purposes. Its street names can be Dimitri, Business Special, Fantasia, Businessman's Trip, 45-minute special. And so DMT works by mimicking the neurotransmitter serotonin. So we know it's serotonergic, and we know that a lot of the hallucinogens have that effect on serotonin. They increase the amounts available. So it's not like the other drugs that are way more addictive. Those are more dopaminergic, and so they tend to increase dopamine. These are more serotonergic, meaning that they mimic and increase more of the serotonin. So it was discovered in South America in 1946. People use DMT by smoking it, snorting it, injecting it, or orally taking it. I question whether it was discovered in 1946. Maybe the compound DMT, but I'm sure ayahuasca has been used for a long time. So the legal status, it is illegal in most countries, but legally available in countries like Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia. It can be smoked or orally ingested. If smoked, you feel the effect in 15 minutes. But if orally ingested, like in ayahuasca, this is if you take the plant, you can feel it for 2 to 6 hours. Or, the difference is that DMT, the synthetically made one, you smoke it and you just feel it quickly. And the side effects are visual hallucinations. And if you drink it, it's visual hallucinations, vomiting, and diarrhea. So what's the high like for DMT? So some people say that it's quite intense. A bad trip can occur, and if so, waiting it out is the only remedy, and this can take hours. And people may also experience a good trip. Some people have used it really to get over PTSD or to get over some trauma, or they just want to learn more spiritually about themselves. And so, again, it causes very strong visual and auditory hallucinations, an altered sense of body, space, and time, life-changing experiences, and visits to other worlds, which sounds kind of cool. And again, I'm not condoning it. I'm not saying go use it, but it's just interesting because I think anything that alters the state of the mind is pretty interesting. And so here's a video if you want to learn more about it. And you can look up videos of people who have taken it and they talk about their experiences. All right, let's switch to MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy and Molly, probably other street names too. So this is structurally related to mescaline and amphetamine, so it kind of works like an amphetamine. It's a behavioral stimulant with the increased dose. It has LSD-like effects, meaning that if you take a lot, it can be hallucinatory, and if not taken as much, then it's more like an emotional effect, more like a body high. Um, However, it's more toxic and more potent than mescaline. And so, if it's kind of like LSD, you know that it's having a serotonergic effect as well. You know that it's affecting the serotonin levels. And so the action is a releaser and or reuptake inhibitor of serotonin. So that means it allows more serotonin to hang out in the synaptic cleft. And if you remember, serotonin reuptake inhibitors are also used in antidepressants, meaning that we want to increase the amount of serotonin available. However, antidepressants, of course, the doses aren't super high like you would find them in these type of drugs. But the whole point is that they block the enzymes that break down serotonin. So if you're blocking those enzymes, that means that serotonin is more available. Actually, I take it back. It's not blocking the enzymes. It's blocking the reuptake. It's preventing serotonin from being absorbed back into the neurons. It just basically makes it hang out more in the synaptic cleft. Anyway, it has this effect also on norepinephrine and acetylcholine to some extent. The psychological effects are not always predictable, and it has, ability for enhanced communication, euphoria, empathy, and intensification of sensory experiences. And if taken too much, it can cause long-term depression, probably because if you're receiving serotonin from another way, your own brain might stop producing it because it depends on this drug, and so it can just have that side effect. Physiological is an increase in blood pressure and heart rate, motor coordination, loss, anxiety, malignant hyperthermia, cognitive defects. It can also cause neurotoxic damage to neural structures, memory functions, and its tolerance, rapid development, meaning that you need more and more as you depend on it. And I did have a friend, this is a long time ago, I'd say maybe like 12 years ago, that she was taking a lot of this, and I was very worried for her. I mean, she wouldn't tell me. I could tell she was on it. But yeah, she started developing a slight addiction to it, and so I was very worried for her because she wasn't herself. But then she ended up moving to Texas, and she's doing really good now, and she has a home out there, and she's doing well. So proud of her. I feel like when she moved, because this is when I used to live in San Francisco, it was just more available there. She just had easy access to it, and so when she moved, it was just a lot better for her. She didn't have access to it. All right, so there's a legal version of a hallucinogen. This is like a light hallucinogen, and it's called salvia. So salvia is a new LSD for today's young people who are entering into recreational drug use. Salvia has been prominent for decades as an herb in Sierra Mazateca area of Mexico and Central and South America, and it is from the mint family, which is just a type of plant. It's used in traditional spiritual and ethnopharmacological practices by Mazatec Indians of the Oaxaca, Mexico. They use it to treat headaches, diarrhea, and rheumatism, and they use it to treat the swollen belly, which is a curse from an evil sorcerer, according to their, religious beliefs. In the USA, it has been used by landscapers as a ground cover. And so this is what salvia looks like. It's very pretty. And it's actually legal in 44 U.S. states, so it is only illegal in Delaware, Louisiana, Missouri, New Jersey, New York, and Tennessee. It is not a controlled substance in the USA, so it's not under Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, none of those. Whereas all of the hallucinogens, I think every single one of those were all Schedule 1, all of the ones that we talked about before, and they're all illegal, except for this salvia here. So it is a controlled substance, meaning that it's not, I don't know if it's necessarily illegal, but it's a controlled substance in these other countries, Sweden, South Korea, Denmark, and whatnot. So street names for salvia are magic mint, ska, Maria pastora, interesting, tripping on Sally D. And route of administration is by chewing the fresh leaves or in a quid and kept in the mouth. Sorry, I meant in a liquid. My bad. Swallowed when eaten raw or in a brewed liquid like tea. And it can be smoked like marijuana, so large, bold pipe, bong, or water pipe, and rolled into a cigarette. The effectiveness depends on the usage, and so if you chew or suck on it or drinking results in a slower onset hallucination but deeper and more sustained experience. Smoking or snorting results in an immediate effect. Using bong or like a water pipe bowl is a more effective and less wasteful method. The leaves are smoked alone and not mixed with the tobacco. In fact, it is not recommended that it be mixed with tobacco into a cigarette. The high can last as much as 1 minute to 2 hours, depending on the potency, and the half life is less than an hour after the hallucination. And so it's just a lighter hallucinogen, but yet legal, interestingly, in the United States. All right, so that concludes our lecture on hallucinogens.